On the surface, it sounds like a typical healing story from the Gospels. Jesus is in a public place on the Sabbath day. Someone comes to him with a need. Jesus sees the need, feels the pain, heals the person, and the religious authorities go berserk. For example, in the 3rd chapter of Mark, Jesus is in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. A man comes to him with a withered hand. Jesus sees the man, has compassion, heals him, and immediately, Mark says, the Pharisees went out and conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. In the 5th chapter of John, Jesus encounters a man who has been ill for 38 years. He asks him if he wants to be made well, and then, without really waiting for an answer, tells him to take up his bed and walk. In that moment, the man is healed, and in the next moment, the Jewish religious authorities begin persecuting Jesus. Just a few chapters later, he heals a man born blind, and the religious authorities object. This man couldn't be from God. Why not? Listen carefully, there will be a test. Because he healed on the Sabbath day, the Jewish holy day, the day in which their law said no work was to be done, including, they believed, the work of healing. So when Jesus restores withered hands, useless legs, sightless eyes, he typically breaks the law, and the religious authorities are typically outraged. So, on the surface, at least, the story in today's gospel reading from Luke sounds just like those other ones. Jesus is in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. He sees this woman there, the one with the bent-over back. He feels for her, heals her, and the leader of the synagogue goes berserk. It falls into the same pattern as all those other healing stories. What makes this one different is the nature of this woman's problem. Luke says she came to the synagogue with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. What some versions translate as a spirit of infirmity. Not an infirmity, mind you, a spirit of infirmity. Luke, the beloved physician, seems to be trying to tell us that the problem this woman faced was not so much physical as it was spiritual or psychological. Could it be that a burdened mind, a burdened spirit could result in a bent-over back? The first time I preached on this passage, I called my doctor to find out. Oh yes, she said, it's called a conversion reaction. Hold on and I'll look it up. And a minute later, she read from one of her medical books a long list of physical symptoms that can be caused by extreme mental or spiritual distress. Fainting, seizures, paralysis, blindness, hearing loss, loss of speech, muscle weakness, difficulty swallowing. The list went on and on. In all of these, she said, there isn't any real physical problem. For instance, a person might be so afraid of what could happen if he leaves his house that he won't even get out of bed. And as a result, he becomes an invalid, not because of sickness, but because of fear. You do hear that kind of language sometimes, don't you? Paralyzed by fear. Died of a broken heart. Worried himself sick. Bill Moyers says that our language is evidence of our innate understanding that the mind and the body are bound together. Or, as my doctor said, the physical and the psychological are intertwined. So, where in other places in the Gospel, Luke says that someone had leprosy or had dropsy or had an infirmity, here he says, a woman came to Jesus with a spirit of infirmity, a spiritual problem that was making her sick. I still remember a story I heard from a colleague years ago, a true story apparently, about a man whose right arm was drawn up in such a way that it had become almost entirely useless. One day the man confessed to his pastor that years earlier he had struck his daughter in anger and injured her to the point that she had to have medical attention, and that it took some time for her to heal. It was during that time, the man said, that my arm began to draw up. I've hardly been able to use it since, but that was years ago. The daughter had forgiven him. But as the pastor listened to that story, he realized that what the man needed more than anything else was an assurance of God's forgiveness. And so he took hold of this man's right arm, drawn up against his chest as it was, and he prayed that the man might be able to accept the truth that God could forgive him of all things, even this. While he was praying, the pastor began to feel that arm relax. And within just a few days, this man had recovered full mobility in that crippled limb. It seems like a clear example of the so-called conversion reaction my doctor described. Once the man was relieved of his guilt, he was also relieved of his problem. And it makes me wonder if this woman in Luke 13 wasn't suffering from a similar condition. There's no way to know. But just suppose that 18 years before she encountered Jesus, she had done something that caused within her such terrible guilt that she could no longer look anyone in the eye. Or perhaps more likely, suppose that 18 years earlier something had been done to her that caused within her such terrible shame she could no longer look anyone in the eye. It's not so hard to imagine, is it? Not in her time, not in ours. At first it would have been a matter of lowering her gaze to avoid eye contact. But eventually she might have begun to lower her head, and then her shoulders, and then her back. Until 18 years later you would have found her hobbling around town using a short, sturdy walking stick to support her bent-over body. In all that time, she would have been looking people straight in the knees, which was probably better for her than looking them in the eyes. Knees don't look back, after all. Knees don't mock or accuse. We can't be sure why she went to the synagogue that day. She may have gone because she heard there was someone there who could heal, but we don't know that. Luke doesn't tell us. He simply says that she appeared, crippled as she was, and that when she did, Jesus took notice of her and responded to her need. Listen to the way Jesus deals with this problem. First of all, he sees this woman. He sees her, a woman who, because of her condition, must have been easy for others to overlook. He sees her, and somehow sees not only the bent-over condition of her body, but also the bent-over condition of her spirit. He seems to have had that ability. If he were the guest preacher here today, if he were standing in the pulpit looking out over the congregation, don't you think he could recognize those of us whose minds and hearts and spirits have been crippled by the things we have done or by the things that have been done to us? Don't you think he could see immediately what we try to hide from everyone else? Jesus' next step is to call the woman to him, and to her credit, she comes. Jesus takes the initiative, but she responds to his initiative. She takes her part in the process of healing. And if any of us who are in similar circumstances are going to be helped, we will need to do the same. When someone says to us, "Come, be healed, be saved, be forgiven," we will have to get up and come. And then Jesus speaks to her, says to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." And do you notice the order? Before laying a hand on her, he assures her of her freedom. "Woman, whatever shame or guilt has kept you roped down and doubled over has left you now. It has been cut loose, and so have you." Only then does Jesus lay hands on her, and when he does, the words he has just spoken come true. Picture it like this. Imagine an actual rope tied like a noose around this woman's neck, looped down and around her knees, keeping her doubled over like that. And then imagine that Jesus puts one hand on her back, reaches down with a sharp knife and cuts through the rope in one clean slice. In that moment, the coiled spring of the woman's spine is released. Her stooped over body straightens up like a sprung trap. She gasps for breath, almost falls over backward, but Jesus catches her, holds her by the shoulders, looks into her eyes. And when she looks back, she sees the first pair of eyes she's looked into for 18 years. And what she sees there is not accusation, but acceptance. She begins to praise God, and the leader of the synagogue goes berserk. You know why, don't you? Because Jesus was healing on the Sabbath. Right. And healing was considered a form of work. Right. And working on the Sabbath was against the law. Right. Listen, the rabbi says to the crowd, there are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days to be cured, not on the Sabbath day. Do you know, I can almost sympathize with that rabbi. At my church, we work very hard to create a worship service that is both warm and dignified. I don't think I would appreciate it if the guest speaker on a given Sunday morning began healing people right and left, and they began running around the sanctuary shouting hallelujah. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14, everything in worship is to be done decently and in order. But Jesus says to the leader of the synagogue and all those who are nodding their heads in agreement, you hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath day untie his ox or his donkey and lead it to water? And shouldn't this woman, this daughter of Abraham who has been tied up by this infirmity for 18 years, be untied on this day of all days? Wouldn't it be the godly thing not to let her wait a minute longer, not to let her suffer a second more, but to release her from this satanic bondage? Jesus understands that setting people free is the work of God, and that there is no day better suited for that than the Lord's day. Do you remember what he said on another Sabbath in his hometown synagogue? The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Let me say it to you on this Lord's Day. If you have been bound by a spirit of infirmity, by guilt, by shame, by fear, by despair, by self-loathing, by defeat, whatever it is that has roped down your mind, your heart, your spirit, hear this word. On this day, in this place, Jesus slices through that rope and sets you free. It is His nature. It is His pleasure. It is the work to which He was called and the purpose for which He came, to set the captives free. When I was a boy, I used to read a beautifully illustrated edition of Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. I remember that in the early pages of that book, a man named Christian started off from his city in ragged clothes with a huge burden on his back, a burden that was meant to represent his sin. It weighed him down. It bent him over. And for the first several pages of that book, he staggered along under the weight of that enormous load. But at last he reached a place where a cross had been erected. And one of the most wonderful pictures in that wonderful book is the picture of Christian standing at the foot of that cross as the heavy load falls from his back and vanishes into a bottomless pit behind him. The straps that were holding it onto his shoulders have been cut through cleanly. for the first time in the book, he is able to stand up straight. And even if you couldn't read the words, you would get the picture. The Christian is set free at the foot of the cross. It seems like kind of an old-fashioned idea. It comes out of an old book written hundreds of years ago. But what if it's true? What if Jesus still has the power to release us from the things that burden us, that bend us over? What if He's calling to you right now, inviting you to come? And what if all He's waiting for is your response?